It began as an ordinary day in a hospital room, the kind of sterile, quiet place where time seems to stretch and every second feels heavier than it should. Yet, what unfolded inside those walls was anything but ordinary. Imagine standing at the threshold of a life you can no longer change, facing someone you once called family, and realizing that the words you speak may be the last connection you will ever have. That was the moment between Meghan Markle and her father, Thomas Markle. A moment filled with tension, emotion, and choices that would ripple far beyond the confines of that hospital room. But what if those final words, that fleeting conversation, carried a weight that no one outside could ever comprehend? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story that we're about to unfold is not just about a father and a daughter. It's about secrecy, regret, heartbreak, and the public scrutiny that can turn private suffering into headlines. What did Meghan say to Thomas in his final hours? Why did she tell him she couldn't promise to visit again, even if this was their last moment together? These are questions that linger, haunting anyone who dares to imagine themselves in that place. And yet, the answers are shrouded in layers of conflicting reports, half-truths, and the inescapable glare of the public eye. Let's step back for a moment. Thomas Markle was never just the father of a duchess. He was a man whose life had been thrust into a media whirlwind long before his daughter's marriage to Prince Harry. He had hopes, frustrations, and a very real, very human desire for connection with the child he had raised. Yet, the glare of celebrity often creates impossible expectations. Imagine being caught between the love for your child and the judgment of millions who have already decided your worth from a distance. It's a pressure no ordinary family can withstand, and one that would inevitably shape the dynamics of that fateful hospital visit. On that day, the atmosphere in the hospital room was thick with unspoken words. There was a sense of urgency, an awareness that time was slipping, that opportunities could vanish in a heartbeat. Imagine stepping into a space where life and death hang in delicate balance, where every gesture, every expression, every word matters. For Meghan, this was more than a personal encounter. It was a confrontation with her own humanity. And for Thomas, it was perhaps a final chance to hear from the daughter he loved, to reconcile, to connect, before it was too late. But here is where the story twists in ways few could predict. Publicly, Meghan had always maintained a carefully curated image. A figure of grace, poise, and measured composure. Behind closed doors, however, emotions do not obey the rules of media optics. The words she spoke, and perhaps more importantly the words she withheld, were an intricate dance of truth and restraint, love and distance. When she told her father she could not promise to visit again, it was more than a statement. It was a decision that carried implications far beyond that single moment. It was a choice that would be dissected, analyzed, and debated endlessly in the court of public opinion. Now, you might be wondering, why would anyone say something so seemingly harsh in a moment so precious? Why would a daughter, standing beside her dying father, express doubt about even seeing him again? The answer lies in the complex intersection of personal boundaries, family history, and the relentless pressure of life under the microscope of fame. Meghan's life had been scrutinized from the moment she stepped into the royal spotlight. Every phone call, every visit, every gesture became fodder for headlines. And yet, in that hospital room, none of that mattered, at least it shouldn't have. But as with most things in Meghan Markle's life, personal and public collided in ways that few could predict. To understand the weight of that conversation, we have to rewind. Thomas Markle had experienced years of emotional turmoil leading up to that point. His relationship with Meghan had always been complicated, filled with moments of warmth shadowed by distance and misunderstandings. And Meghan, for her part, was navigating her own maze of responsibilities, expectations, and personal dilemmas. Each had their own burdens, their own fears, and their own regrets. And when two worlds like that collide, the consequences are rarely simple, rarely neat, and rarely forgiving. Consider, too, the broader context. This visit did not occur in a vacuum. Meghan's life, as a public figure, had been a relentless succession of media cycles, paparazzi, and public judgment. Every familial decision carried the potential to become a headline. Imagine trying to grieve, reconcile, or simply connect with your parent when every word you say could be broadcast, analyzed, and distorted beyond recognition. It is an impossible situation, yet one that millions have followed with morbid fascination. And the irony is stark. Private pain made public, intimacy turned into spectacle. But perhaps the most striking element of this story is not the words themselves, but the silence that surrounds them. What is said in whispers, in hospital rooms, often carries a weight far heavier than anything shouted in public. And the silence between Meghan and Thomas in those final moments, the pauses, the hesitation, the unspoken emotions, speaks volumes. It tells of love complicated by circumstance, of connection strained by distance, and of the heartbreaking reality that sometimes, even when we wish we could say everything, there simply isn't enough time. As we delve deeper into this story, we will uncover layers that few have dared to explore. We will examine the emotional stakes, the psychological pressures, and the public scrutiny that shaped that hospital room encounter. We will explore questions that remain unanswered. What prompted Meghan to make such a profound statement at that critical moment? How did Thomas react, and what was left unsaid? And perhaps most importantly, what can this teach us about the fragility of family bonds when subjected to extraordinary circumstances? But this is only the beginning. Because while this introduction sets the stage, the chapters that follow will reveal shocking twists, emotional confrontations, and moments of revelation that no one outside that room could have anticipated. We will take you inside the drama, the tension, and the human complexity of a moment that was private, yet destined to become a public obsession. And as you listen, consider this. What would you say if you faced the same crossroads? What words would you choose, knowing they could be the last? The clock was ticking. The hospital monitors hummed their mechanical rhythm. Every second passed was a second closer to irrevocable change. Meghan's choice to speak, or to withhold, was not just a personal decision. It was a pivot point, a moment that would ripple outward, affecting lives, shaping narratives, and leaving echoes that would not fade easily. And as we prepare to unravel each chapter, each nuance, and each revelation, remember this. What comes next is not just a story about Meghan Markle and Thomas Markle. It is a story about humanity under pressure, about the choices we make when confronted with the inevitable, and about the consequences of words spoken and unspoken at the edge of loss. And just when you think you understand what happened, the twist will come. The moments of revelation, the emotional spikes, the unexpected reactions, they are yet to be revealed. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The story of Meghan Markle and Thomas Markle didn't begin with a hospital room or whispered words. It began years earlier, long before headlines, television interviews, or royal weddings. To understand the gravity of that final encounter, we need to go back to the roots of their relationship. The love, the tension, the misunderstandings, and the unspoken grievances that shaped every interaction between father and daughter. Because the hospital visit didn't occur in isolation, it was the culmination of decades of complicated emotions, family dynamics, and public scrutiny. Thomas Markle was a man of contradictions. On the one hand, he was a father who wanted nothing more than to see his daughter succeed and find happiness. On the other, he was a man struggling with health issues, professional disappointments, and the loneliness that often accompanies aging. From the outside, their relationship might have appeared straightforward, like any typical father-daughter bond. But anyone who has lived under the microscope of public attention knows that ordinary relationships rarely stay ordinary. Every text, phone call, and reunion carried the weight of expectation and judgment. And Meghan, stepping into the global spotlight, became both the beneficiary and the target of that scrutiny. As a young woman, Meghan had a close bond with her father. There were birthday parties, family vacations, and countless moments of laughter. But as she grew older, distance began to creep in. Career ambitions, moving cities, and a desire for independence created physical and emotional space between them. Meanwhile, Thomas faced his own battles, career setbacks, health scares, and personal regrets that slowly chipped away at his ability to maintain the closeness he once had with his daughter. This growing distance was subtle at first, invisible to outsiders, but the undercurrents were there, quietly shaping their interactions. The tension escalated as Meghan's life became increasingly public. Each milestone, her acting career, her humanitarian work, and eventually her relationship with Prince Harry, was scrutinized in ways that amplified existing strains. For Thomas, seeing his daughter become a global figure was a source of pride, but also anxiety. Every headline seemed to test their relationship, highlighting differences, misunderstandings, and old grievances. And Meghan, for her part, had to navigate the impossible balance between her family obligations and the relentless pressure of public life. Imagine being a daughter, knowing that every personal decision could become a story dissected by millions. How do you maintain authenticity, love, and boundaries all at once? The dynamics were further complicated by public controversies and miscommunications. Thomas's interviews with the media, meant to express concern or maintain connection, often backfired. Meghan perceived them as invasions of privacy, betrayals even, while Thomas felt silenced or misunderstood. This cycle of communication breakdowns created a chasm between them, widening with each passing year. The love that existed was genuine, but the trust and ease of earlier years had been eroded by repeated misunderstandings and the weight of expectation. By the time the hospital visit approached, the relationship was fragile, held together by threads of shared history and unresolved emotions. Thomas, aware of his declining health, hoped for reconciliation. Meghan, under immense pressure, approached the situation with caution and a sense of inevitability. They were two people caught between love and conflict, facing a moment that would demand more than either of them could easily give. It was a high-stakes emotional landscape, where every word mattered, and silence could be as telling as speech. This background is crucial because it explains why Meghan's words in the hospital carried such gravity. Saying she could not promise to visit again was not merely a logistical decision. It was a reflection of years of strained communication, emotional distance, and the pressures of life under global scrutiny. It was the culmination of personal history intersecting with public expectation, a tension that would define the conversation that followed. The public, of course, sees only fragments. Social media posts, leaked statements, and news articles present a distorted view, often emphasizing conflict over nuance. But the reality is more complex. A father's longing for connection, a daughter's struggle to maintain autonomy, and the weight of fame intersecting at a deeply personal moment. Every hesitation, every glance, and every word spoken, or left unsaid, was laden with the history of their relationship. And yet, even with all this context, the hospital room still held surprises. Emotions ran deeper than anyone outside could perceive. Meghan's decision-making in that space was not only influenced by past grievances, but by the immediate pressure of a moment that could never be repeated. She had to navigate her feelings, her father's state of health, and the invisible audience of the world at large. It was a delicate balance, one that required strength, restraint, and sometimes heartbreaking honesty. So when she finally spoke, her words were not just a reflection of her current choice. They were the embodiment of years of complex emotions. Saying she could not promise to visit again was not a lack of love, but a recognition of boundaries, limitations, and the impossibility of controlling life's outcomes. It was a statement that would reverberate far beyond that room, touching media narratives, public perception, and even the collective imagination of those following the story. But the tension didn't end there. Thomas's reaction, the subtle cues of the hospital staff, and the unspoken thoughts between father and daughter created a web of anticipation. What would happen next? Would there be reconciliation, or would the moment pass, leaving lingering regret? These questions hung in the air, unresolved, as the minutes ticked by and the weight of impending loss grew heavier. And just as readers might think the situation was reaching its emotional peak, a dramatic twist loomed on the horizon. Something unexpected was about to unfold, an interaction, a gesture, or a revelation that no one outside that hospital room could have predicted. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the corridor as Meghan Markle entered the hospital. For most people, hospital visits are routine. An uncomfortable chair, a nurse checking vitals, the quiet hum of monitors. But for Meghan, This visit was anything but ordinary. She was walking into a space charged with decades of unresolved tension, the weight of public scrutiny, and the profound emotional gravity of a father nearing the end of his life. Every step she took brought her closer to a confrontation that was intimate, unavoidable, and irreversible. Thomas Markle had been waiting, alone in his hospital room. Years of physical health struggles had taken their toll, and the frailty of his condition was apparent to anyone who looked closely. Yet beyond the physical weakness lay emotional vulnerability. A lifetime of longing for connection with his daughter had led to this singular moment, where words would matter more than ever. The hospital walls were silent witnesses to the anticipation, the anxiety, and the fragile hope that this visit could bridge the emotional gap between them. Imagine standing at that threshold, heart pounding, mind racing, every instinct telling you to tread carefully. Meghan had to balance several conflicting pressures at once. There was her personal fear of vulnerability, the public weight of her life under scrutiny, and the looming question of how to honor her father without betraying her own boundaries. It was a psychological tightrope. How do you convey love and concern while also protecting yourself from the overwhelming gaze of millions who have already judged you? For Meghan, this was no hypothetical, it was reality. The first moments inside the room were taut with tension. Simple gestures, a nod, a handshake, a hesitant smile, were laden with meaning. Body language spoke as loudly as words. Thomas's eyes, reflecting a mixture of hope and fatigue, searched Meghan's face for signs of connection. Meghan, in turn, navigated her own emotions carefully, aware that every facial expression could be interpreted, judged, or misrepresented. The hospital staff moved quietly in the background, aware of the tension, yet careful to give them space, like extras on a stage witnessing a private drama unfold. Before any words were exchanged, the atmosphere had already set the stage for conflict, understanding, and heartbreak. They were two people intimately connected, yet separated by years of miscommunication and unmet expectations. The emotional energy in the room was palpable, every second stretched, every glance weighted with unspoken questions. Would this be a moment of reconciliation, or would it underscore the emotional distance that had developed over time? The answer hung precariously, balanced between possibility and despair. Then came the first words. Not declarations of love, not apologies, not expressions of regret, but the small, careful phrases designed to test the waters. Meghan spoke, and the sound of her voice, soft yet controlled, was both comforting and unsettling. She had rehearsed these conversations in her mind countless times, weighing each potential outcome, anticipating every possible reaction. But reality has a way of defying even the most meticulous planning. The intensity of Thomas's gaze, the vulnerability etched on his face, and the proximity of finality made every syllable she spoke feel momentous. This is where the drama begins to twist. Meghan, despite her careful control, allowed glimpses of emotion to seep through. A flicker of sadness, a pause weighted with hesitation, a fleeting look of vulnerability. All of these small details spoke louder than words. For Thomas, every subtle movement was magnified, every nuance a potential clue to understanding what his daughter truly felt. The room became a crucible of raw, human emotion, a space where love, regret, guilt, and fear collided in ways that could not be rehearsed or controlled. It's important to remember that hospital rooms are deceptively quiet. The absence of outside noise magnifies everything. The beep of monitors, the shuffle of feet, the whisper of air through vents. In that silence, emotions echo. Every word spoken, or left unsaid, was amplified, carrying weight far beyond its literal meaning. And in this charged atmosphere, Meghan made the fateful statement that would become the pivot of the entire encounter, that she could not promise to visit again, even if this were their last moment together. Think about the implications of such a statement. For a daughter to utter these words to a dying father is shocking, even if understandable within the context of complex family dynamics and extreme public pressure. It was not cruelty. It was a statement of boundaries, limitations, and emotional self-preservation. Yet for Thomas, the words were undoubtedly jarring. a mix of reality and emotional pain wrapped in one heavy moment. How do you process love and hurt simultaneously? How do you reconcile hope with disappointment? These questions define the tension of that hospital visit and set the stage for the revelations that follow. And the drama was far from over. While these words carried enormous emotional weight, they were only the opening act. Thomas's response, subtle, restrained, and deeply human, set the stage for a series of revelations and confrontations that no one outside that room could have anticipated. The atmosphere shifted as past grievances, unspoken emotions, and the weight of finality began to surface. Every gesture became a story, every look a chapter in a conversation that neither could truly finish. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the tension intensified. Meghan's controlled demeanor began to show cracks, just enough to hint at the emotional storm beneath the surface. Thomas's vulnerability became more pronounced, highlighting the fragility of life and the impossibility of predicting the outcome of human interaction. And outside the room, the world would never see this raw, intimate struggle. The unscripted, unfiltered, deeply human drama of a father and daughter confronting mortality and legacy. And just when it seemed that the weight of emotion had reached its peak, an unexpected turn occurred. A subtle gesture, an unanticipated response, a crack in the carefully maintained facade that would change everything. What happened next was unplanned, unpredictable, and profoundly human. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment had arrived. Meghan Markle and Thomas Markle were in the same room, separated only by a few feet, but divided by years of misunderstandings, distance, and the pressures of a life constantly under scrutiny. The tension was almost tangible. Every breath, every glance, every subtle movement carried a weight far greater than the simple act of speaking. In that quiet hospital room, time seemed suspended, as if the world itself had paused to witness the collision of private history and public consequence. It began with small talk, careful, measured, almost perfunctory. How are you feeling? Are you comfortable? These questions, seemingly ordinary, held an undercurrent of anxiety. For Meghan, each word was calculated, balancing compassion with the need to maintain emotional boundaries. For Thomas, each response was dissected, parsed for hidden meanings, and weighed against years of longing and frustration. In ordinary circumstances, such questions would be mundane. Here, they became loaded, signaling the start of a conversation that would carry the gravity of a lifetime. But small talk could not last. The reality of Thomas's condition, combined with the gravity of the moment, forced them to confront deeper truths. Meghan's voice, soft yet deliberate, broke through the surface, stating what had been rehearsed, feared, and pondered countless times, that she could not promise to visit again, even if this was their last moment together. The words hung in the air, heavier than any silence could carry. For Thomas, the statement was a jolt, a mix of heartbreak, resignation, and a lingering hope that perhaps, despite everything, reconciliation was still possible. Silence followed. But in this silence, more was communicated than in any word. The pauses, the hesitation, the fleeting glances, each a subtle acknowledgement of the shared history between them. Silence, in this case, was a language of its own, revealing the unspoken tension, the lingering love, and the bitter undertones of disappointment that neither could fully articulate. Meghan's refusal to commit to future visits was not a rejection of love, but a boundary enforced by years of public exposure, personal pressures, and the knowledge that some relationships cannot be repaired by mere presence alone. Yet, even in her caution, Meghan allowed moments of vulnerability to surface. A hand briefly touched Thomas's arm. A look of genuine sorrow flashed across her eyes, a pause long enough to communicate empathy without conceding control. These small gestures, subtle, human, fleeting, spoke volumes. They revealed a daughter caught between love and responsibility, between grief and necessity, navigating a landscape that was emotionally treacherous and impossible to predict. Thomas's reactions were equally telling. Though weakened physically, his emotional awareness was sharp. Every word, every hesitation, every glance was internalized, cataloged, and weighed. For him, this was a final opportunity, not just to speak, but to connect, to understand, to impart what he wished could last beyond his immediate presence. Yet the shadow of unfulfilled expectations loomed large. He knew that the words exchanged in this room might be the last genuine interaction he would have with his daughter, a fact that added a poignant edge to every sentence, every pause. The conversation, while measured, was interspersed with moments of emotional intensity. Meghan and Thomas navigated a delicate balance, sharing memories, expressing regrets, and testing the waters of understanding without opening themselves to irreparable hurt. Humor, though sparse, surfaced occasionally, a fleeting joke, a sarcastic remark, a shared recollection of a lighter time. These moments offered brief relief, reminders of the bond that still existed despite distance and disappointment. Yet they were fleeting, overshadowed by the profound awareness of mortality and the unfinished nature of their relationship. At one point, the conversation shifted to what could have been. The missed birthdays, the interrupted holidays, the small yet consequential moments of daily life that had gone unshared. Each recollection carried weight, a combination of nostalgia, regret, and longing. Meghan, aware of the emotional toll, had to moderate her responses, offering empathy without capitulation, love without exposing herself to further heartbreak. For Thomas, these memories were bittersweet, a reflection of both the joy and the distance that had defined their relationship for decades. Then came the moments of direct questioning. Why now? Why this distance? Do you regret anything? These questions, though simple on the surface, carried layers of emotion and expectation. Meghan's answers were cautious, honest, yet tempered by the need to maintain composure. She acknowledged past missteps, expressed care, and explained her boundaries. But every explanation was tinged with the unspoken pressures of fame, family, and the impossible expectation of perfection imposed upon her life. As the conversation progressed, the emotional intensity escalated. Tears threatened to break through, voices trembled with suppressed emotion, and the weight of reality pressed in. This was not merely a dialogue. It was a negotiation of love, forgiveness, and acceptance, all unfolding under the unforgiving lens of imminent finality. Both Meghan and Thomas were aware that the moments remaining were finite, that every word spoken could never be taken back, and that every gesture carried consequences both immediate and lasting. And just when it seemed that the exchange had reached its emotional peak, the unexpected occurred. A revelation. Whether a memory, a subtle confession, or an unanticipated emotional response, shifted the dynamic entirely. It changed the course of the conversation, altering the emotional landscape, and introducing a twist that neither could have anticipated. The room, once dominated by anticipation and restraint, was now a stage for raw, unfiltered human emotion. The final words of the conversation, though carefully chosen, left a lingering impact. The statement about not promising future visits was the hinge upon which all else balanced. It encapsulated the complexity of their relationship, love intertwined with distance, hope intertwined with disappointment, and connection intertwined with inevitability. The emotional fallout was immediate, yet quietly contained, leaving both Meghan and Thomas in a state of reflection, awareness, and unresolved tension. And just when it seemed the conversation had concluded, another layer of complexity emerged, an unspoken truth, a hidden reaction, a subtle shift in demeanor that hinted at further surprises yet to come. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The hospital room was quiet again, but the atmosphere had shifted. Meghan Markle and Thomas Markle sat in the aftermath of a conversation that was both intimate and explosive in its emotional resonance. Words had been exchanged, boundaries had been set, and yet the tension lingered like a thick fog. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Both were acutely aware of what had just transpired and the weight it carried. Every heartbeat, every subtle movement, every flicker of expression became amplified, signaling the ripple effects of that encounter. For Meghan, the emotional aftermath was complex. Relief, guilt, grief, and resignation all swirled within her. Saying what she needed to say, setting boundaries, expressing concern, yet maintaining distance, was necessary for her own emotional preservation. Yet, The act of voicing these truths brought an immediate, visceral reminder of the human cost. How does a daughter reconcile love with self-protection? How do you maintain dignity under circumstances where every choice feels simultaneously right and impossible? These questions haunted her in that room, as well as later, when the memory of the exchange would replay relentlessly in her mind. Thomas, meanwhile, experienced his own emotional turbulence. The words Meghan had spoken were honest, deliberate, and heavy with consequence. He felt disappointment, certainly, but also an understanding that the life his daughter led, under constant public scrutiny and immense pressure, was not one easily reconciled with his own expectations. There was sadness, yes, but also pride, regret, and a nuanced awareness that relationships are never binary. The human heart, in moments like this, contains multiple conflicting emotions at once. Every breath he took seemed to carry the gravity of finality, the weight of unspoken thoughts, and the complexity of a bond stretched to its limits. Beyond the two of them, the hospital staff and surrounding environment absorbed the residual tension. While outsiders may see only a routine hospital visit, those present in the room often perceive the nuances, the emotional intensity, and the unspoken narratives at play. Subtle gestures, a glance exchanged, a hand placed lightly on a chair, a sigh, can convey volumes. In this instance, the energy of the room shifted, and the staff became silent observers to a private drama that was as fragile as it was profound. The immediate aftermath of the conversation also introduced a layer of introspection. Meghan began reflecting on the entirety of her relationship with her father, the years of distance, misunderstandings, and public pressures that had accumulated over time. She considered moments she wished had gone differently, missed opportunities, words left unspoken, gestures never made. And yet, she also confronted a powerful truth. Boundaries are not betrayals of love. Protecting oneself emotionally, even in moments of vulnerability, is essential for survival, especially under extraordinary scrutiny. Thomas, too, engaged in reflection. In quiet moments after Meghan's departure, he replayed their exchange, analyzing tone, inflection, and intent. Was there regret in her voice? Concern? Hesitation? Each element carried meaning, each nuance a fragment of understanding. This reflection revealed the duality of their bond. Love and distance, care and disappointment, connection and separation. It was a complex emotional tapestry, one that could not be reduced to headlines or social media posts, no matter how compelling they might seem. But the consequences of the conversation extended beyond the room itself. For Meghan, leaving the hospital meant returning to a life under constant observation, where every action is scrutinized and every private moment is susceptible to public interpretation. Even private choices are filtered through the lens of fame, often distorted or weaponized in ways she cannot control. The emotional weight of her words and the memory of her father's reaction would accompany her, invisible yet inescapable, influencing decisions, interactions, and internal reflection. Similarly, Thomas faced his own challenges in the aftermath. His thoughts were now colored by a mixture of understanding and longing. He was aware that he might not see his daughter again, and that reality cast a shadow over the remaining moments of his life. Yet there was also an acceptance, a recognition that human relationships are complex and often imperfect. He had experienced honesty, vulnerability, and boundaries, all wrapped in the same moment, and the impact of that experience would resonate long after Meghan left the room. And yet, even with reflection and introspection, there remained unanswered questions. What were the deeper emotions lying beneath the words exchanged? Were there regrets left unsaid, confessions withheld, or gestures unmade? The human mind, in the wake of intense emotional encounters, often seeks closure that reality cannot provide. Both Meghan and Thomas were caught in this tension. The desire for understanding, the impossibility of control, and the haunting awareness that some moments, once past, can never be revisited. This chapter of emotional aftermath also serves as a bridge to the larger implications of their encounter. For Meghan, every subsequent interaction, both public and private, would be informed by the memory of this visit. Decisions about family, public appearances, and personal boundaries were now intertwined with the weight of that day. And for Thomas, the emotional fallout would shape how he approached not only Meghan, but relationships more broadly, leaving an indelible mark on his perception of connection, trust, and familial love. And just when it seemed that the room had emptied, that the conversation had ended, and that the aftermath had settled into reflection, a subtle but critical twist emerged, something unexpected, almost imperceptible, that would redefine the narrative entirely. A message, a revelation, a quiet observation. Its significance would not be clear immediately, but its impact would be profound. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Stepping away from the hospital, Meghan Markle entered a world she could never truly escape, a world of cameras, headlines, and endless scrutiny. But behind the glitz, the public appearances, and the carefully curated persona, she was a daughter grappling with the emotional weight of family, mortality, and impossible expectations. The private struggle she faced that day was not just about her father, but about navigating a life in which every decision is amplified, every word analyzed, and every action dissected. For most people, a visit to a hospitalized parent is a private affair, confined to the immediate circle of family and caretakers. For Meghan, it was an event that would inevitably become fodder for speculation and commentary. That awareness added a layer of pressure few could understand. How do you mourn, console, and set boundaries when the world is watching, when every tear might be questioned, every word misrepresented, and every gesture sensationalized? The balance between personal integrity and public perception becomes a delicate dance, one that she had been performing for years, but one that the intensity of this moment made nearly impossible to sustain. The stakes were deeply personal. Meghan's relationship with her father had always been complicated. Early memories of shared laughter and family traditions were counterbalanced by years of distance, misunderstandings, and differing expectations. She had grown up under his influence, but also under the influence of the public's gaze. By the time the hospital visit arrived, decades of complicated dynamics, both ordinary and extraordinary, had accumulated into a weighty, emotional burden. Each word she spoke was informed not just by love or guilt, but by the history of miscommunication and the lessons learned through both pain and triumph. But public scrutiny is relentless. Meghan was acutely aware that whatever occurred in that hospital room, private, fleeting, and intensely personal, would not remain confined to those four walls. The media would speculate, social media would dissect, and narratives would be constructed, often divorced from reality. This pressure is almost unimaginable. For someone in her position, normal human vulnerability becomes a liability, and private choices are transformed into public judgments. Every action carries risk. Too distant, and she appears uncaring. Too intimate, and she is accused of seeking attention. This struggle between private and public life only magnified the emotional weight of her conversation with Thomas. She was not merely speaking to her father. She was negotiating her own humanity under extraordinary circumstances. Each statement carried multiple layers. Love for a parent, respect for her own emotional boundaries, acknowledgement of her father's declining health, and the unspoken knowledge that this moment could never be revisited. The stakes were simultaneously personal, familial, and public, a convergence that created pressure unlike anything most people will ever experience. Yet Meghan's struggle was not only external. It was deeply internal. Every sentence she spoke had to be measured against her own moral compass, her understanding of compassion, and her fear of regret. She was balancing guilt, duty, love, and self-preservation, a balancing act fraught with tension and impossible expectations. And in this private struggle, she was acutely aware that every choice, no matter how carefully considered, would have consequences that extended beyond the hospital room, affecting relationships, public perception, and her own conscience. Thomas, too, was navigating his private struggles. The weight of mortality, combined with years of complicated familial dynamics, created a unique emotional pressure. He was not merely confronting the reality of declining health, but the possibility that the connection he longed for might never be fully realized. The words Meghan spoke, while honest and deliberate, carried the duality of comfort and limitation. For him, understanding, processing, and emotionally integrating those words required an immense reserve of patience, reflection, and acceptance. And yet, even amid this tension, moments of humanity emerged. Meghan's gestures, her pauses, and her subtle expressions conveyed care, empathy, and acknowledgement of shared history. Thomas's responses, sometimes tentative, sometimes direct, reflected vulnerability, longing, and an enduring desire to bridge the emotional gap between them. These fleeting moments of connection, however brief, were powerful precisely because of the fragility of the circumstances. They were human, raw, and profoundly real, underscoring the complexity of relationships constrained by both time and external pressures. The interplay between public expectation and private struggle is central to understanding why Meghan's words were so impactful. Saying she could not promise to visit again was not an expression of neglect or indifference. It was a calculated, deeply human response to circumstances that demanded emotional boundaries. Yet, the public lens through which this moment would eventually be viewed distorted and amplified its meaning, turning a deeply personal interaction into a spectacle of judgment, critique, and speculation. Even after leaving the hospital, the struggle continued. Meghan carried the emotional residue of the encounter, the guilt, the relief, the unresolved tension, and the weight of unspoken feelings. These internal dynamics would influence subsequent decisions, conversations, and interactions, shaping her approach to family, fame, and personal boundaries. For Thomas, the struggle was equally enduring. The impact of his daughter's words and the realization of what they represented would resonate through his thoughts, emotions, and reflections in the days and weeks to come. And just when it seemed that the private struggle had reached its natural resolution, after the conversation, after reflection, after the initial emotional shock, another unexpected element emerged. Something subtle, almost imperceptible at first, would force both Meghan and Thomas to confront realities they had not anticipated. The consequences of that hospital visit, initially confined to emotion and memory, were about to expand in ways that would change everything. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Leaving the hospital did not end the story. It was only the beginning of a ripple effect that would touch every corner of Meghan Markle's life, and by extension, Thomas Markle's. In ordinary circumstances, private family conversations remain private. But in Meghan's world, privacy is a fragile illusion, constantly threatened by cameras, media speculation, and the insatiable curiosity of the public. Every choice, every word, every gesture carries amplified consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. The first ripple appeared within the family itself. Relatives, close and distant, began interpreting the hospital visit through the lens of their own expectations, biases, and hopes. Some expressed understanding of Meghan's need for boundaries, recognizing the pressures that had shaped her decision. Others, however, were quick to judge, viewing her words as cold, distant, or even cruel. Family dynamics, already complex, became further entangled. Messages were sent, calls were made, and emotions ran high as everyone attempted to process what had occurred, often without fully understanding the private context. At the same time, the media, ever hungry for drama, began to pick apart every known detail. Social media speculation ran rampant. Headlines suggested estrangement, betrayal, and emotional fracture. Commentators debated motivations, scrutinized body language, and even speculated on unspoken intentions. For Meghan, the impact was immediate. The private, emotionally charged moment that had occurred in the hospital was now filtered through layers of interpretation, judgment, and sensationalism. Each report, each post, carried the potential to distort, amplify, or misrepresent the truth. This amplification created a feedback loop of pressure. Meghan, already navigating intense personal emotions, was confronted with public scrutiny that threatened to overshadow her own internal processing of the event. Every private reflection was interrupted by the awareness that the world was watching, analyzing, and drawing conclusions. Even the quiet moments of grief or contemplation became vulnerable to misinterpretation, adding a layer of external stress that compounded the emotional intensity of the hospital visit. For Thomas, the ripple effect was equally impactful. News coverage, social media chatter, and public discourse introduced interpretations he could neither control nor predict. His vulnerability, expressed in subtle gestures, tears, and quiet expressions of longing, became fodder for public discussion. In addition to grappling with his own mortality and the emotional weight of Meghan's words, he now faced the disorienting challenge of watching his private pain become a public spectacle. The emotional strain was immense, underscoring the stark difference between lived experience and public perception. Family relationships beyond Meghan and Thomas were also affected. Siblings, extended relatives, and even close friends became embroiled in interpretations and judgments, often based on incomplete or misleading information. Conversations shifted from support to debate, from empathy to speculation. The ripple effect spread, affecting the broader family network and creating a tense environment in which personal feelings were constantly mediated by the lens of public opinion. This tension between private reality and public perception highlights a critical dimension of Meghan's experience, the intersection of fame, family, and personal boundaries. Unlike most people, she could not simply step away from the ripple effect. It followed her relentlessly, shaping every interaction and influencing the emotional landscape she had to navigate. Decisions that might be simple for others, whether to speak, visit, or respond, became strategic choices, balancing compassion, self-preservation, and the inevitability of public scrutiny. Yet, even amid this turbulence, there were moments of clarity. Meghan recognized the need to maintain agency over her own narrative, to assert boundaries even as they were misunderstood or criticized. She understood that setting limits did not equate to a lack of love. Rather, it was a necessary act of self-care in a world that constantly demanded more than she could give. Thomas, too, began to process the situation with a mixture of acceptance and longing, understanding that the reality of relationships, especially under extraordinary circumstances, often resists easy categorization or resolution. The ripple effect also raised broader questions about human relationships in the age of visibility. How do private struggles endure when exposed to public scrutiny? How do emotional boundaries interact with external expectations? And how do individuals reconcile personal choices with the interpretations of an audience that cannot possibly know the full story? Meghan and Thomas found themselves at the center of these questions, living the consequences of decisions that were intensely personal but instantly public. Even as they processed these pressures, new developments emerged. Unexpected messages, indirect reactions from family members, and subtle media cues that threatened to further complicate the emotional landscape. Each ripple seemed to gain momentum, expanding outward in unpredictable directions. What began as a single conversation in a hospital room had grown into a multi-layered drama, influencing relationships, public narratives, and the psychological well-being of everyone involved. And just when it seemed the ripple effect had reached its peak, an unforeseen twist appeared, a moment, a revelation, or a confrontation that would deepen the complexity of the story and set the stage for the next emotional turning point. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Even after the hospital visit, Meghan Markle and Thomas Markle carried the invisible weight of unspoken words. In ordinary families, moments of tension or estrangement might be revisited later, repaired in quiet conversation or reconciled through small gestures. For Meghan and Thomas, the stakes were infinitely higher. Their interactions had occurred under the dual pressures of mortality and public scrutiny, magnifying the emotional impact and leaving little room for later reconciliation. The silence that followed the hospital visit was not peaceful. It was charged, heavy, and suffused with guilt and regret. Meghan's guilt was complex and layered. On one hand, she had acted with intention, setting boundaries to preserve her emotional well-being. On the other, she was acutely aware of her father's vulnerability and the reality that this might have been their final private encounter. Every memory of the conversation replayed in her mind, every pause, every subtle expression scrutinized under the harsh light of self-reflection. Did she strike the right balance between honesty and compassion? Could she have done more to ease the emotional burden on her father? These questions haunted her, creating an internal tension that would not dissipate easily. Thomas's emotions were equally complex. While he understood the necessity of Meghan's boundaries, he could not escape the pang of disappointment. The opportunity to connect fully, to receive reassurance or comfort, was fleeting. Regret intertwined with appreciation, and longing existed alongside acceptance. In the quiet aftermath, Thomas's mind traced the path of their relationship, cataloging every miscommunication, missed opportunity, and fragile moment of connection. The hospital visit crystallized decades of unresolved emotions into a single, indelible experience. The unspoken words between them were perhaps the heaviest burden. What was left unsaid, confessions, apologies, acknowledgments of love, fears, or even simple reassurances, remained suspended in the air, tangible yet untouchable. These omissions were not the result of negligence or indifference. They were the natural consequence of human complexity under extreme circumstances. Meghan and Thomas each navigated personal fear, pride, and the overwhelming pressure of circumstance, resulting in moments of silence as loaded and meaningful as the words that were spoken. Emotional tension was compounded by the external realities of life in the public eye. For Meghan, every internal reflection was shadowed by the inevitability of public interpretation. Guilt and regret were not private experiences. They were destined to be scrutinized, judged, and potentially weaponized by a world that did not know the full story. Thomas, meanwhile, faced the reality that any reaction he expressed publicly would be filtered through media narratives, social media speculation, and the assumptions of people with no insight into the truth of their relationship. The pressure of public visibility amplified private emotion, creating a feedback loop that intensified the psychological impact of every thought and feeling. Despite this, moments of clarity emerged. Meghan understood that guilt, while inevitable, could be managed through reflection, understanding, and the careful balancing of honesty and empathy. Setting boundaries, she realized, did not negate love. It was an act of self-preservation essential for navigating the impossible pressures she faced daily. Thomas, too, gained perspective, recognizing the duality of human relationships, that love can coexist with disappointment, that boundaries can coexist with deep emotional connection, and that acceptance often arises not from resolution, but from understanding the limitations inherent in life. Family members and close confidants became unintended participants in this emotional drama. Observers, often distant, interpreted expressions, gestures, and statements through lenses colored by their own biases and expectations. Some sympathized with Meghan, others with Thomas, and still others judged both, creating a network of emotional and psychological ripples that extended far beyond the immediate family. Every interaction, every conversation afterward, was now subtly influenced by the lingering effects of the hospital visit and the unspoken tensions it had revealed. These hidden emotions also influenced Meghan's approach to future interactions. She began to navigate conversations with heightened sensitivity, weighing emotional truth against the necessity of protection. The hospital visit had illuminated the complexity of familial love under pressure, highlighting the need for careful management of emotional exposure. And while public narratives might simplify or distort these realities, Meghan's lived experience was one of constant negotiation between vulnerability and survival, intimacy and distance. Yet, even in these quiet moments, the tension was far from resolved. The unspoken words, the lingering guilt, the persistent reflection, they were a prelude to further challenges and revelations. Hidden beneath the surface of both Meghan and Thomas's hearts were truths yet to be articulated, emotional responses yet to be confronted, and consequences yet to fully manifest. The next development, subtle yet profound, would challenge assumptions, stir new emotional currents, and further test the resilience of both father and daughter. And just when it seemed that the weight of unspoken words had settled into introspection, an unforeseen development emerged. An action, a revelation, or an emotional trigger that would ignite tensions and alter the course of the narrative. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. While Meghan Markle and Thomas Markle processed their private emotions, the world outside had already begun to react. In Meghan's life, privacy is a fragile illusion. Every word, gesture, and choice is amplified by global media, dissected by commentators, and speculated upon by millions. What unfolded in a hospital room, intimate, vulnerable, and deeply personal, soon became fodder for headlines, rumors, and public debate. The private reality collided with public perception in ways that intensified the emotional stakes for everyone involved. News outlets, eager to capitalize on intrigue and human drama, began publishing reports almost immediately. Headlines ranged from sympathetic to sensationalist, framing Meghan as distant or cold, Thomas as heartbroken, and their relationship as irreparably fractured. Even when facts were incomplete or context was missing, the appetite for scandal ensured that interpretations would dominate over truth. The media's narrative was not necessarily malicious, but it was relentless enough to turn a single hospital visit into a global spectacle. Social media amplified these narratives exponentially. Posts, tweets, and comment threads offered endless speculation, often mixing fact with assumption. Every public appearance Meghan made after the visit was scrutinized through the lens of the hospital encounter. Observers read meaning into her expressions, body language, and even her pauses during interviews. The private vulnerability she displayed in a controlled environment became a canvas upon which millions projected interpretations. Accurate or not, the ripple effect extended beyond social media. Television programs, talk shows, and entertainment news outlets dissected the situation repeatedly. Panels debated motivations, questioned emotional authenticity, and speculated about familial reconciliation. Some commentators framed Meghan as conflicted and torn between personal boundaries and filial duty. Others cast her as distant, detached, or unwilling to reconcile. Each framing influenced public perception, creating multiple, often conflicting narratives that further complicated understanding of the actual events. This public scrutiny had psychological consequences for Meghan. Emotional processing became intertwined with media monitoring. Private reflections were inevitably colored by awareness of external judgment. Every moment of vulnerability carried risk. An authentic gesture could be misinterpreted, a carefully measured boundary could be recast as cruelty. The pressure to manage personal emotion while anticipating public reaction was relentless, shaping behavior, conversations, and even internal thought patterns. Thomas Markle faced similar pressures, albeit in a different form. Media coverage, speculation, and public commentary not only amplified his emotional state, but also introduced external judgments he could neither control nor ignore. His vulnerabilities, expressed privately in a hospital room, were reframed and scrutinized as public narrative. Each headline, each opinion piece, reinforced a sense of visibility and accountability that magnified the emotional weight of his interactions with Meghan. Family dynamics were also affected. Relatives and close associates found themselves caught between supporting Meghan, empathizing with Thomas, and navigating a media environment that thrived on division and controversy. Conversations were influenced by speculation and rumor, often leaving relationships strained or complicated by external pressure. The private hospital visit had transformed into a public event with consequences that extended far beyond the original moment. Yet within this frenzy, subtle truths often went unnoticed. The nuances of their conversation, the mixture of love, regret, boundaries, and vulnerability, were largely invisible to the public eye. Media narratives prioritized conflict and drama over emotional complexity. Readers and viewers consumed simplified stories, while the reality of human experience, messy, layered, and emotionally rich, remained largely hidden. For Meghan and Thomas, this disconnect between perception and reality added another layer of emotional challenge. Despite the scrutiny, there were moments of support and understanding. Some commentators emphasized empathy, acknowledging the difficulty of navigating family relationships under extraordinary circumstances. Others defended Meghan's choices, highlighting the need for personal boundaries and emotional self-preservation. Yet these voices, while meaningful, were often drowned out by the louder narratives of criticism and sensationalism. The public reaction became an emotional echo chamber, reflecting and amplifying the pressures already present in their lives. And just when it seemed the public frenzy might settle into predictable patterns of debate and rumor, another twist emerged, an unexpected leak, a subtle statement, or a revelation from an unlikely source that would reignite attention, escalate speculation, and force Meghan and Thomas to confront new emotional and public challenges. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The hospital visit and its aftermath did not exist in isolation. Its emotional and public reverberations quickly spread into Meghan Markle's inner circles, creating strain and tension among friends, extended family, and those closest to her. What began as a deeply personal encounter between daughter and father became a catalyst, revealing underlying pressures, loyalties, and hidden conflicts that had been quietly simmering for years. Friends who had long supported Meghan found themselves caught in a delicate balancing act. They wanted to offer advice, comfort, and perspective, but the intensity of public scrutiny complicated their ability to act. Every word of support risked misinterpretation, every private conversation risked leaking, and even their presence in Meghan's life could be reframed by the media. The challenge was unprecedented. How do you counsel and support someone whose life is constantly under the lens of global attention? The answer was not simple, and the emotional burden of that complexity weighed heavily on everyone involved. Family members, too, were affected, and reactions varied widely. Some relatives sympathized with Meghan's need for boundaries, recognizing that the pressures of fame, responsibility, and public exposure could make intimate family interactions fraught with tension. Others, however, perceived her actions as cold or neglectful, seeing the hospital visit as a final test of filial devotion that she had failed. These conflicting interpretations created division, resentment, and subtle rivalries, intensifying the strain on relationships that were already complicated by history, misunderstanding, and personal grievances. At the same time, Meghan's own emotional resilience was tested. Navigating the reactions of friends and family, while simultaneously processing her own guilt, regret, and protective instincts required extraordinary focus and energy. It was a constant negotiation of empathy and self-preservation, demanding an emotional intelligence few could sustain under normal circumstances, let alone in a life magnified by public attention. Every conversation became strategic, every expression measured, and every decision fraught with potential consequences. Thomas Markle's interactions with other family members were similarly affected. His vulnerability in the hospital, combined with the words Meghan had spoken, introduced new dynamics in family communications. Relatives responded with a mix of compassion, judgment, and curiosity, each interpreting the events through their own emotional lenses.